Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the Western Australian Ports Conference. I'm Jeff McMullen. I would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners, the Noongar people, who have been the custodians of the land that we have gathered on this morning, and also this part of the coastline for longer than any of us really knows. So to give us a welcome to country, to bring us together with the idea of what we might call sustainable, Aboriginal people know as custodianship. So please welcome the Noongar Elder Marie Taylor.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And let me say that I can relate to ports because on my Wadjala side, the white side of my family, which is of Dutch Pommy heritage, my great-great-great-grandfather was sent out here on a boat and he was a jailbird for stealing a loaf of bread. So they sent him out here. As a result of that, I'm here. And today, I warmly welcome you. This is the land of my mother's and my father's families on the Aboriginal side, or as we say, the Whadjuk Noongars. So let me warmly welcome you in the language of my people, which over the years I have been relearning and incorporating into my daily work life. Abba, Whadjuk Baladong Noongar Birdia Yok, Wanju Noongars, Noongar Wom, Wedgelas, Birdias, Nija Yorkania Bibbleman Borja, Nija Warring Management Kundam Borja, Mort Janabidi Nija Borja Naja Balapin Weir McNinning, Ngalakan Wankani Ni, Karajinan Kora, Yai Buddha. The Aboriginal custodian welcomes all peoples here to the land of the people of many breasts. This is crow and cockatoo dreaming land, whose families and ancestors tread the grounds, leaving footprints upon the land, where their spirit lingers on, surrounding us through stories as we listen, look, learn and talk like our people did in the past. We are doing so today and we will continue in the future. Nunak an korin kumbawaran pakija, alija nuna borja you are kor nicha, yalagonga borja, nicha, derbal yaragan borja, wanju, wom. Some of you may have come from over the Great Sea or from your lands to come and sit at the campsites of our great leader Yalagonga. We are here sitting on his land. The Derbal Yarragon, Nijaboru means the estuary of the Swan River on Perth. Ni, ngan wanju nunuk nija, nunga borja karamora kepich bil, ngama nija kurup, ngant, mangach, urukul, ngada kanango ngank, alija, kundan nanango mamba kut bilyang, kui waranka. Kubari Dujarat Bayou, Gundi Warring Management, Mut Kuraborja, Kundam Kura Kurich, Yai Benong Dokich, Yokai Anna. And as I warmly welcome you here to Noongar country, let me remind you that this is the land of rolling hills and dales, running water of rivers, swamps and rock holes, where the grass tree, the gum tree and the bankshire blooms and grows beneath the glowing sun, whilst the thundering sea rolls over the golden sand to call upon the singing magpie, whose song will awaken the sleeping people and remind us that our heartland dreaming is to learn from the past today before shouting victory tomorrow. Shuai, shuai, warawirn bulyaka, 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 muriap, murichwirn, nichakara, noriji bornawanking. Invites the bad spirits to leave the room, the good spirits to come and be upon each and every one of you. And as I hang the bunch of gum leaves, its interpretation is that I don't come in anger. Let me leave a special blessing from me to you. Chidong really kurbari nort ngan Ngoyang mangits ngan yakaning nunak yay buruan. Maman yura wot cool nunakan, yining palama, ramalija bala yakaning buruan, ngalakan nija. Wajak nunga borja, ma warabin, ngalakan borja courage, ngala mort. Like the flight of the boomerang, the Kulbadi flies and feeds on the sweetness of the banks here. So may our Father God above bless and keep you all as you sit in the palm of his hand under the shadow of his almighty wing. And until we meet here again on Noongar country, and as the clouds billow upon our country, let me remind you of the words of this little chorus which I've turned into Noongar. Ngalakan Canning Mort, Ngalakan Bulla Mort, Ngalakan Bulla Borjak Yual Kur, Yakaning Ngala Kunda, Doinch Doinch Warakan, Ngain, Nunuk, Ngalak, Mrich, Mort. We are one, but we are many, and from all the lands on earth we come. We share a dream and sing with one song. I am, you are, we are solid Australians. Yunka, thank you.
Thank you, Marie, for connecting us to the longer timelines of our history and giving us another way to look ahead. The gathering of good minds here clearly comes at an extraordinary time in the history of this state and this country, because we are on the cusp of the greatest port reform Australia has ever known. New trade opportunities, new demand for growth, a new way of thinking, arguably, of ports as gateways. And so for every delegate today, the challenge is to stretch our mind to this vision, to look ahead, to shape a strategy not only for our time, but for all of those generations that clearly will benefit from the right strategy for all of those future Australian generations. So turn off your mobile phones, please, and connect to the speakers here this morning and see if we can stretch to the new thinking. We are going to take some short breaks through the day for tea and coffee, but if you need, the restrooms are in the foyer on the right as you came into this room, and hold your questions if you can till the Q&A sessions that will come after each cluster of speakers. If we can move the day along with the efficiency and pace of a good Port Authority, there will be plenty of time for everyone to ask important questions. Not long speeches, but we're covering a lot of ground in one day because we know you have the talent to do that. So, to move to the issues and to introduce the vision, the themes of this day, it's my pleasure to introduce the Chairman of Ports Western Australia and also Chairman of the Albany Port Authority, Mr. Peter West.
What a great turnout. So on behalf of Ports WA, I welcome you all here to this, the 26th biennial conference. The host, of course, is Dampier, if you haven't got it already. And as a novelty, they've decided to host it away from home. This is in order to let us stakeholders get here more easily. Now, we recognise that that also means that we delegates are denied the delights of the Dampier Peninsula for a couple of days, but we accept the trade-off. The Dampier Chairman, Brendan, CEO Steve and their teams have done all the hard work, and to them will go the bouquets for a great conference. The rest of us in Ports WA, as colleagues and as underwriters, will share the brickbats, if there are any. I'm sure there won't be. I'd like to acknowledge the sponsors, not just because they have now saved us from any financial exposure, but because these conferences probably wouldn't occur without their help. I'd have to say our debt-challenged shareholder, the state, would probably choose dividends rather than the delights of this conference. Steve has asked me to speak on the future role of Ports WA, and this I'll do briefly. It's very much a personal view rather than a collective view, and it's based on 6 years of my being chairman at Dampier, 6 years chairman at Albany, and 11 years involved with Ports WA in total. For those of you not involved with Ports WA and not interested, I apologise, but I'll be very surprised if you don't have an association with some like activities that you may well be able to give us advice or support. That would be gratefully received. As context, the Ports WA Council is simply composed of the Port Chairman, 8 of them, Port CEOs, ditto, a representative from the Department of Transport to cover the Shipping and Pilotage Act ports, that's those ports not currently covered by the authorities, and a secretary, that's 18 people. We meet regularly as a council, 3 monthly. We also meet, the CEOs meet separately, and we meet irregularly, both as CEO and chairs group. So there's a fair bit of interface. The aim of the organisation is essentially to enhance the benefits to the state by shared representation and by mutual support, in a nutshell. So what is targeted by this group will also be determined by their own backgrounds, their knowledge of business and experiences, and their knowledge of state government activities. It's interesting to note that the majority of the 20 chairmen who've existed over my 12-year period in Ports WA have been experienced managing directors, CEOs or general managers, current or retired, from the private sector. In fact, all 8 were for a number of years in the middle, and this was targeted. But in total, only 2 of those 20 were from the public sector. Conversely, of the 21 CEOs in the period, the majority were experienced managers from the public sector, followed by ex-mariners and then people from the private sector. This may not seem relevant to the talk, but I think it is, and I think it's very important. The objectives for the port authorities are well known to most of us, and that's simply facilitate trade, number 1, make a modest return on assets. That's probably increasing a bit now to a reasonable return, while of course being professional and providing good governance. There's an unwritten objective, which is to provide a bridge between the owner, the state, and the private sector, which is basically the users and the people who service the ports. So balanced port boards and management teams are important because they allow empathy with both sides of that. And from my experience in projects and proposals, that has been a valuable bridge. The essence of the difference between the 2 sectors is probably about risk management. Business is risk. Politicians in the public sector have risks, but they're different risks from my experience. I should also point out that each port authority is totally independent and accountable to the Minister, not just by the dictate of the Act, but normally because of the background and nature of the chairman. They are generally protective of their independence and take total accountability for their port's performance and accept that risk, which matters to some. This also seems a very important characteristic of the current setup, which is worth preserving. However, from a Ports WA perspective, it's not always easy getting alignment, or even sometimes getting all the chairmen together. I can confirm this from my own personal experience, not from a chairman's role, but from the other side. And I'd have to say with a hint of embarrassment, because in my first year at Dampier Port, and it was my first year out of the private sector in retirement, I shamelessly minimised my involvement with the collective because in the private sector, anything vaguely resembling a quango, if you remember that old quasi-autonomous non-government organisation but supported by the government, was just something you avoided, along with spending hours with people you don't know, listening to various topics, some of them you're only barely interested in. You've all heard the expression herding cats. I was one of them, and it's not unusual amongst this fraternity. Cats are independent. They walk alone. All things are alike to them. You don't herd cats. Other than for the first time, they come together only if there's enough in it for them. And the first time they come out of some morbid curiosity of knowing what the other cats are like from a distance. You need a lot of catnip to keep them coming. Catnip can be in the form of information, ideas, outcomes, efficiency, fellowship, even sympathy. Sometimes stroking is not something you get a lot of in leadership positions. So, with that context, now let's briefly look at what Ports WA does, should do, in my opinion. And I list 5 activities. First is the obvious one of providing a platform for communication and good relationships across the ports. It's been done on the basis that familiarity breeds favourability. If it was the only thing you were doing, you might do it more efficiently than the various meetings I've already mentioned. And this conference, indeed. And it's not just for the people in the ports, it's people outside. But this has led over the years to a strongly collegiate spirit between the Port WA community, chairman, CEO, and at next level of management. It opens the avenues for individuals to seek and offer assistance and to share information. It offers the extension to an efficient face-to-face interaction between the Port Authority community and various stakeholders, including government departments. The Department of Transport in particular has a senior representative on the council currently, so that's easy. Presentation and discussions were had with the Treasury, Office of EPA, DST, various others, including the Minister when he's not busy doing Treasury stuff. But there are, whenever there are port issues and policies to discuss across the level. No doubt these can be better orchestrated, but at the very least, this is a role for Ports WA, which should be an enduring one. Reduction of the number of ports will, I think, enhance this activity because the organisation of meetings now can be rather unwieldy. The second activity for Ports WA, in my opinion, offers significant benefits to the individual ports is the overseeing of systematic peer group systems and an ultimate peer review activity. Many of the large organisations, corporate organisations now, and certainly ones I've worked with, mandate peer reviews between independent business units. For example, on safety, environment, large projects, and in their overall business. We can't move to that in a hurry. It needs some assistance, experience, and confidence. And eventually a culture where criticism turns into joy of an opportunity rather than criticism. And a belief that other people do things better than you, and vice versa. We all understand that, but we don't necessarily act it all the time. Rarely is there genuine competition between our ports. They only intersect at the boundaries or the extremities of the supply zones. And anyway, the common shareholder is the Minister, and our underlying objective is to do whatever is in the state's best interest. So there is no reason not to share all of our best practices to the benefit of the state and all users, I might add. We're not starting from scratch here. There are already good functional peer groups in environmental managers, finance managers, harbour masters. But the prize beyond that is the prize of avoiding the metaphorical incidents of when the ship hits the sand, be they financial, environmental or operational. When that happens, the subsequent external investigations, usually by ministerial decree, have normal overkill reaction, significant reputational impact, both individually and the ports as a group. And that is one of the reasons that the private sector are much more inclined to do peer reviews. It is a very effective way of getting alternate opinions. Whether there are 8 port authorities as now or 5 in the future, there nevertheless will be in the order of 10 discrete port operations which lend themselves to this sort of review. My third activity is short and simple one of investment in our human capital. Full responsibility here, of course, is with the individual port leaders, with their employees. However, because of the scale, even with amalgamations, they're relatively small businesses, and the opportunity for advancement within the one business are limited, and so you often have people leaving the organisation and then you're employing more people in. That is a risk, and it hasn't always worked. The more we can grow our own, the better, and short, long-term secondments, transfers and various opportunities for technical growth inside can be managed, perhaps by an HR manager's network. Fourth and fifth activities are about advocacy. First, and again simply, it's regarding the recognition of the importance of ports. This has changed a lot in the last 3 years. This was a fairly big element for Ports WA, but we've gone from relative obscurity to being relatively spotlit in those last 2 or 3 years. We've also had the advent of the Department of Transport with its greater resource and focus on ports. Between they and the Minister have done a very good job on advocacy of the role and significance of the ports. I, for one, have been happy with that change. We probably only need now to monitor the appropriate profile is maintained. Finally, the more complex one on advocacy on port policy and strategy. I can't do justice in my last minute or two, but that's by design because I don't know the answer. Ports Australia does a good job for us on a federal level, but at a state level, it will be up to the 5 Port Authority leaders of the day in the future and or the Minister to decide as to whether that advocacy is by individual port authorities or through Ports WA. 2 things seem very clear to me. It will be a significant waste of available and informed resource if the ports are not active in this area, and a common position will be required for the advocacy to land effectively. So to the end, ports are gateways. You'll hear more about that in just a moment. They're also hubs where transport modes intersect, where strategic plans come together, as do many relationships, some fleeting, some lasting, but all meaningful. This is one of the reasons I think that most of us are here today and like to be associated with ports. Personally, I'm grateful for the relationships I've had shared with many of you over the time I've been involved. So from Ports WA, best wishes to Dampier on a successful conference, and on with the show.
Thank you, Peter. Throughout the day, we will be looking at clearly different models, different solutions for the reform that we've spoken of. But there also has to be a search for common ground, some conviction that the common good will emerge from the vision for port reform. And that's been a characteristic of the industry leadership of our next speaker. To outline a vision of ports as gateways, please welcome the Chairman of the Dampier Port Authority, Brendan Hammond, who is also Adjunct Professor of Sustainability at Curtin University.
Jeff, ladies and gentlemen, again, as a follow-on from last night, it's great to see you all, and I trust that the day is going to be as vibrant and as rewarding as we all hope. A couple of things before I begin my talk, which were stimulated by the events so far this morning, really relate to the magnificent welcome to country from Marie Taylor. And as I sat just in front of her here and was truly inspired by one of the most moving welcomes to country that I've ever experienced, I thought to myself that it might be interesting to start my talk with a little bit of group self-contemplation. Very brief and no answers because they're pretty obvious around the room, but I wonder how many Aboriginal people are represented in this group. Don't answer, just look around. Personally, I find that shameful. And without wishing to lay my personal feelings on you, I would certainly say that I think it presents us with a challenge that is as yet unmet. And okay, even if there are not many, if any, Aboriginal people in the room, I wonder how many of us in this room, whilst we know many Aboriginal people and we do business on Aboriginal land, and indeed as ports in Western Australia, we are uniquely placed in the Aboriginal world because of a whole variety of things. Geography, we are in the regions, and secondly, the import of custodianship of land and water in the Aboriginal world. And I wondered how many people in this room, as leaders of our industry, have a deep and close relationship with Aboriginal people and Aboriginal culture. And to put not too fine a point on it, I wondered how many of you might, for instance, have Aboriginal skin names. And please, it's a rhetorical question rather than one that I'm looking for an answer on. I think the answers to these questions pose us serious and very rewarding challenges, and I would encourage you all to act on them. Moving forwards, I'm going to do a lot of reading through my presentation, for which I apologise. It's not my normal modus operandi. I prefer to talk freely. However, there are a great variety of things that I wish to say in very specific order and in a very specific way. So forgive me for seeming to read more than I would otherwise freely communicate. I thought as my introduction to this conference, I should do nothing more nor less than merely expand on its theme. And the best way for me to do this is to share with you some of the journey that we have been on for the last 4 years at the DPA down the Gateway path. The word gateway, of course, is not new. In fact, it's in danger of becoming hackneyed. Nor are many of the basic concepts on which pretty much everybody seems to agree with regards to gateways. At the DPA, however, we decided to examine these concepts very carefully and deliberately to see if we could use them to do better business. In other words, to see if we could do more than talk about them, but if we could translate them into action. And if we did so, how might we set about doing that? As we did this, we realised that the concepts were, of course, relevant, and that the best way to apply those concepts was to use them to shape our business context. Of course, business context is the fundamental and core driver of business outcomes. So we proceeded to do this and thus set the DPA on a path of reinvention with enormous benefits to all of our stakeholders and our shareholders. It is an ongoing journey of innovation, invention, adaptation, and very, very significant growth. And as you will see, it has resulted in a Port Authority of a completely new and different complexion. So to start with, if ports are gateways, what indeed is the role of a port authority? The answer to this is that a port authority becomes a custodian on behalf of the natural owners, shareholders of the gateway. And Peter has heard me say this before, and so have many of the other chairmen of Ports WA. I do differ with the common and I think somewhat loose definition of a minister as a shareholder. I do not hold any government of the day to be a shareholder of the ports or the gateways. Indeed, the natural owners, shareholders of the gateways are the people of Western Australia, and more broadly Australia. That is all of us in this room. And as the custodian of that gateway, we are members of management of the day. And management of the day is constituted by the political and administrative structures that we are part of. Now, this may seem like a play on words, but it's not, because it means that we are responsible and we are custodians at a much deeper level than if we are merely playing to the pressures of any given realm of government. Sorry, I can't see what's going on down there. So this, and as the custodian, we have sole mandate to own the fundamental assets of the gateway, these being the seabed and the land. We regulate the waterways, and we are accountable to ensure that the gateway operates and grows in the most efficient and effective manner. I do apologise for this. This is not running the way I hoped it would. So this creates a unique position in the value chain which does not compete with anybody else. Indeed, in contrast, it adds value to all other gateway players. The business model and the role become centred around strategic commerce. We occupy different headspace, we think differently, we do different work, and we achieve different and better outcomes. And the numbers do the talking. This is not philosophy. This is about outcomes. So we focus on making the gateway frictionless. We focus on enablement, flexibility, and nimbleness. And we focus on gateway productivity. To give you an interesting example of where this leads us, probably somewhat controversially, we see absolutely no benefit in the Port Authority operating port infrastructure. This can and should be done by others who do not carry the inherent operational and capital inefficiencies of government. It is, however, our job to ensure that port infrastructure is developed as necessary and as efficiently as possible, taking the long and the short term into account, and that it is subsequently operated by the best party in the best manner and delivers the best outcomes for all. So this context and this business model connects usefully and seamlessly with our legislative mandate as follows. The gateway consists of multiple assets, hard and soft, social and environmental and economic, all of which have value, some of which, however, may not have a current price. As the custodian, we need to understand the nature of this pool of assets, and we need to attach monetary value to all of them. By doing this, we're thus able to ensure that profit is made by the growth in value of the existing pool of assets and through the creation and addition of new assets. In doing this, we ensure that short-term gain does not compromise long-term common good. We understand and manage the subtle but stark differences between price and value. We become ever more fiscally prudent whilst investing wisely, and we have all of the correct fundamentals to place ourselves properly in the risk-opportunity continuum at all times. This is what constitutes strategic commerce. It is a critical point to understand that it is these principles that drive improved governance, rigour and discipline in the business in a manner that no others can, through the realisation that waste and inefficiency in any and every form does not just lead to a reduction in profit, they also detract directly from the value we leave behind for all future generations. They create an intelligent, vibrant and rewarding workplace where people increasingly move from being employees to being willing investors of a piece of their lives, because they live in a system that drives this behaviour. As such, governance and efficiency and effectiveness become everyone's concern, not just that of the executive. It creates a natural and valuable point of creative tension when we see other players in the gateway engaged in wasteful and inefficient activity, particularly but not only our brethren in government, and it allows us to assist them to resolve the issues in a constructive manner. And by doing this well, we become catalytic in driving the appropriate investment and expansion in the most optimal ways that result in national, state, and indeed regional development. And of course, the natural and logical outcome of all of this, rather than driver, is that trade growth is facilitated as per our legislative mandate, underpinning the economic growth that we all rely on. So this in brief, at a very high level, quite purposefully, from a functional and design perspective, is our journey down the gateway path at the DPA. All of our outcomes to date, bar none, every metric that we have, supports and verifies that this business model delivers greatly improved outcomes for ourselves, our shareholders, our customers, and all other stakeholders. There is, of course, the subsequent story of business execution to add to what I've just said. And I would encourage all of you who are interested to attend the session by Steve Lewis in this regard later this morning. There are some copies of this picture in the back of the room available for you. I thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day, and I sincerely look forward to a great deal of discussion and debate on this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. Brendan, excuse me. Western Australia's government began integrating transport, as many of you know, in 2010, and our next speaker at that time had a key role when he became CEO of the Public Transport Authority to address the WA vision of port reform. Please welcome now Reece Waldock, the Director General of the Department of Transport.
Thank you, Jeff, and good morning to all. I've just come from a budget breakfast, so I've had a good feed today, which is a good start. Interesting enough, John Howard was upstairs speaking, and whilst he didn't speak about WA ports, I guess I'm disappointed to say, what he did talk about, of course, is WA. I'm going to pick up some of those themes, but I think if you look at the budget, and you might question where it goes and post-September. But if you look at the budget, I think the great message for me, and I think for people in this room, is that the work that we have done with the ports, with industry, transport, we've actually put together, I think, extremely credible plans over the next 20 years that's driven infrastructure decisions, both at state government and now particularly federal government. We did extremely well. A lot of where we did well in this budget was because, as I say, we've actually put very cogent, sensible plans together for the future, and people believe we can deliver. So that's important, and all those plans, of course, feed in to the logistics chain which we're talking about today. So if I can just, I also should say, I've got a challenge today as well. My minister's speaking later, and one thing you learn as a senior bureaucrat is you don't want to steal the minister's thunder. I've got no idea what he's going to talk about, so it's a bit shaky. My future's a bit shaky generally these days, but what I can say, the port's future is a lot stronger. So let me talk a little bit about the future, the port's future. I want to also talk a little bit about where we are, what are the issues, what are the challenges, and clearly what is the way forward. So if we can just move through. Most of this is pretty, I think, self-evident. We have experienced, I think, an economic growth. The Premier doesn't want to talk about mining boom, but certainly there are indications that we've peaked in some of this area. But what we've seen is increased demand by the freight transport providers. We know that our networks have been stretched to the limit, and indeed increased pressure on the whole of the infrastructure, which I'll talk about. That increased pressure, in so many ways, I think, has really, I guess, challenged us as a state and as an industry to make sure we actually understand our role in the logistics chain and make sure we actually can sell the message to people that actually can influence decisions in terms of investment and the like. So, if we keep moving through, this shouldn't be a surprise for anybody. It's been well and truly articulated, but look at what we've done in exports over the last 10 years, 12 years. Many of us, I see in this room, were around with me in 2000, and to think we've actually seen exports grow fourfold. We've seen the share of the national commodities exports increase from 26 to 46%. In fact, John Howard did say when he used to come over, he used to love talking about WA, feeding the chooks a bit, I guess, but 39%. Well, for John Howard now, it's 46% and growing. And of course, as we'd all, I guess, like to share with our East Coast colleagues, we now have more exports out of WA than Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria combined. So it's a good story for the West and something we should keep reminding everybody that wants to listen. In terms of the economic growth, I think this is the important part. We all know what mining does and what it means in terms of our gross state product. But I think more importantly, if we look at the future, and the future is uncertain, there's no question, but I think what we're seeing in terms of those growth figures, 5% in 13-14, 4.25% in 14-15, that's the latest Treasury figures. And if you look at those figures, that's certainly with national figures running at 2.75% in 13-14. We're still outstripping the country by at least double in most measures of performance. And finally, whilst that 190 billion of resource projects, sure, they're under consideration, there will be some further work to be done, no decisions have been made. I think that there may be some ups and downs, but because of the market uncertainties, but it's all generally a pretty healthy picture. And it's interesting when you look at the current situation, how have we done? Well, I think we've done remarkably well. One, we've actually haven't seen major bottlenecks, and I think that's a testimony to the people in this room, how they perform. And indeed, if you look at the East Coast, whether it be New South Wales, Queensland, it's not the same story. And what it's also meant, the act that certainly I was involved in developing back in 1990s, I think it's been an extremely strong act. It's actually served us well. And even now, as we see changes, and changes are emerging, will emerge, the principles of this act will never change. So, I think, again, we've made some good decisions and we've performed extremely well. I don't want to go into this. This is the Minister's going to be putting, I think, some of this to us. But let me just share in terms what the export imports. That 1 billion tonnes of 2031, that's 1 billion tonnes, more than 1 billion tonnes of exports. That'll be through the current port authorities. With the expanded port authorities, that 1 billion tonnes is probably most likely to be 1.3 billion tonnes, 2.5 times greater than current volume. So if we understand that, we understand what's happening. Road networks, an area that I spend a lot of my time in, 40 million tonne kilometres per annum. Twice, certainly, current volumes, and more particularly, they're running at least twice population growth and vehicle kilometre growth. So we're seeing enormous demands and expectations from our road system. And even if you look at the rail lines, rail is in fact growing even faster than road freight. So again, we need to do lots of planning up to 2031 and beyond. This is what happened, will happen during the course of this year. I mean, I think that's a great story. It's a story of just what we're seeing in real terms. That averages well over 10% growth for our ports. A very, very solid picture. If most businesses could grow at 10% per annum, they'd be doing extremely well. This is what we believe will be happening over the ensuing 7 years. And again, I think a very strong picture of development. And these, I think, aren't guesstimates. These are pretty much locked in. And again, if you look at not just port authorities, but the wider ports under the new model, that'll be, of course, greater again. So, what are we doing? We're about policy, strategic planning and investment decisions aimed, as what Peter and Brendan have said, looking at the state's long-term economic prosperity. And the Minister will be talking on this, but I just wanted to make the point with our freight plan, which will be launched today by the Minister. It is about freight. It recognises we are very different from the East Coast. For the first time in that focus, we've actually done modelling based on what industry is telling us, both ports and directly to the miners and the like, the generators of business. And what we've done is we've modelled that, we've modelled under different scenarios, and we're very confident what we're seeing in terms of our expectations and what that'll mean in terms of priority projects over the next 20 years. I think we've redefined, I think hopefully more clearly, what government and private sector should be doing. And I think I want to make the point that it's not just an ordinary, I guess, typical historical government strategy that often ends in general rhetoric. What we've done here is a very clear network plan. It's not policy, we're not talking at regulation, pricing, demand type measures. We are looking at a network plan, and we're saying what we need to do in this state over the 5, 10 and 20-year timeframes. I think, again, for the first time, it'll be launched today. Please read it. I think it's a very significant piece of work. And it's interesting if you look at the road space, because I think the road space for me is pretty important, because clearly I'm directly involved. You know, if you look at the investments we're doing in terms of freeing up the land side, and land side is just so critical as we help working with you to develop our export and our ports. The land side, we've put, over $100 million into Esperance, Bunbury, both the access road, the ring roads. Certainly, as well as that, we've done the Dampier duplication, again, well over $100 million. And we're putting well over $200 million currently into the Great Northern Highway Port Hedland upgrade. So you're seeing all these projects of feeding our ports, feeding our business, feeding what we're here today to talk about. And of course, we're looking at other ones. We're looking at stage 2 and 3 ring roads. We're looking at the Albany ring road. We're looking at, and Jim Limerick and Chris will be sort of smiling, the High Street access into the Port of Fremantle. We've been talking about it a long time. We actually have got funds, we think, to drive in the next few years. So, again, all good news stories. It's not just about building roads, of course. It's about protecting our roads, both in terms of corridors and buffer areas, and we're working very closely to make sure, with you, to make sure that happens. Not going to talk about rail too much, other than we know rail's a very important part. We work very closely with Brookfield, the lessees of our rail system, and I think you've seen some significant investments, of course, in the Midwest and in the Esperance area, but we'll see greater investments, particularly in the southwest. So I think all pretty good news. And if you look at the WA port developments, I'm not going to go through this, but be assured that these port developments, and I'll go through the areas very quickly, they're either real projects or high potential projects. And as I say, if you look at what's happening in Pilbara, you realise why it's the hot spot, not just of Western Australia, but it's the hot spot of Australia. a good news story. Midwest, of course, Gerald, great efforts there in Carrara, and we've done very well working with PDA, working with the port in terms of getting the railway through with Brookfield. Fremantle Ports, lots of things happening and continuing to happen in that space. Southern Port, not just Bunbury, Albany's also looking at a new grain player, and of course Esperance in terms of its market sounding. So lots of developments happening. I'm not going to talk about the vision because I'm sure the Minister's going to talk about the vision, but it's certainly picking up what both certainly Brendan said and Peter alluded to as well. Let's talk just as I try and finish this talk on time, let's talk a little bit about the policies. I mean, certainly if you think about both just fair and equitable access, and I think when you talk access, we should be talking pricing as well. It's critical, and I think what state ports do, and this state will continue to have state ports, not privatised ports. What we'll be doing is making sure, of course, fair and equitable access and pricing is available to all users and service providers. We'll clearly, supply chain, that's our business now, supply chain, landside and ports, we'll continue to put a lot of effort into that, and certainly in the metropolitan area, access corridors, buffer zones are just so critical. You know, I'm talking about a 20-year plan now. We're moving on to the next 50-year plan. We need to do that when we're talking large infrastructure, and it's great to think that the ports are also responding in those timeframes as part of the national and state port strategies, and certainly we're currently working on and finalising a WA port plan. So, what are some of the policies? Well, as Brendan said, we are trade facilitators. I think he's also made the very good point that we are moving towards landlord models, strategic landlord models, but clearly the transition and the timing will be subject to what makes sense, and I think that's important to understand. In private investments, that's the new way forward. Government is now fully supporting that approach and working with the ports, and that's good news for us all. We've talked about efficiency and effectiveness, other than to suggest again that we are very much the front end of driving the state's economy. And finally, I think I'll make the point that when we talk about our ports, it's got to provide both self-sustaining in terms of the port's business, but it's also got to give a reasonable return, and this is critical to government. And government is the custodian of what the people own, of course, but it's very, very important that that is understood. So what are the key challenges? As I sort of move towards the end of this presentation, we need to understand that growth expansion, we are the front end, we need to actually invest in that, and it is so critical that we're able to meet that. And in terms of investments, I know now many of the ports have issues in terms of even having what they would see as a decent minor capital works program with long-term security. I think we understand that, I understand that. We need to continue work on that with the state. But when we work on those things with the state, I think we all recognise, and I'm sure the Treasurer speaking later will just remind us all about the AAA credit rating, which is so fundamental to governments, both state and federal. But perhaps more importantly, if we thought it was tough over the last few years, and it has been tough in terms of capital, I think it's fair to say that the next 4 years is going to be even a tougher fiscal environment. So we need to understand what that means in terms of, I think, the way forward. And the way forward, look, we've done a lot of work on this with the ports. We've actually worked with ports, we've worked to transport, Price Waterhouse. We put a proposal to government about modelling different funding models for private sector investment, and we'll continue to drive that, and I think it's pretty exciting when you look at what that means. We're already seeing clearly some pretty exciting developments both at Dampier, Esperance and Port Hedland in that space. We'll have to again remind ourselves that it's about adequate cash flows to drive port business, but it's also looking at the rate of return for government and making sure that as owners we in fact do still see a sensible rate of return. And finally, I think it is interesting as we continue to work with Treasury and other stakeholders, I think we are making some real ground. This part of this work is looking at port improvement charges for common user sort of infrastructure. And I think it's interesting there that whilst it's early days, We have got ERC approval to consider these options in terms of funding major capital infrastructure, and we also know at this stage at Port Hedland particularly are doing some very, very good work in this space. I think I've done pretty well. I've finished on time. Thank you very much, and let's discuss it further during the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Reece, and we look forward to the Minister joining us later in the morning and hearing his address. Barely a week goes by if you follow international finance where somewhere in the world there's a major economic shock or change or surprise. And so to stay in the zone with your thinking, as our next speaker likes to put it, is plainly a challenge in the 21st century. So drawing on his research, which includes China's influence on port developments, Asian economic development in a broader sense, and closer to home, the factors where reform of ports have failed us here in Australia, will give us a challenging vision of ports in Australia in the 21st century. Please welcome Professor Malcolm Tull of Murdoch University.
Thank you very much, and special thanks to the Port of Dampier Authority for inviting me. I had a knock on my office door earlier this week and someone was standing there with a basket with some wine and cheese, and I said, oh goodness me, what's this for? And apparently it's for being a keynote speaker. And I think it's a vote of confidence that they actually pay us in kind, as it were, before we actually deliver. So I thought I'd better make sure I turn up. Okay, I can't, oh yes I can see the screen. Okay. These are the topics I'm going to talk about, but I won't go through that list in detail. But essentially, I'm going to canvass the broader perspective of ports and some of the issues that ports face, and draw on some of the more recent research and some of the insights that can be gained from that research. Ports as gateways. Well, we already know, of course, from the very interesting address by Brendan, the importance of this notion, and so I don't really need to restate it. Ports are not only gateways, they've been gateways for a long time, they're also logistic hubs and parts of global transport chains. An important role is trade facilitation. Now, there are various ways of defining this. Essentially, we can think about it as reducing trade costs. And I think from the Port of Dampier's vision of gateway ports, we have a very interesting expansion on that, a broader concept. I recall that traditionally European ports have always had a kind of wider view of the role of ports, not simply a very narrow perspective focusing on the port itself, but having a broader view of the role of ports in the community and the economy at large. And I think that here we have a nuanced, a modern version of this, which I think is extremely interesting. For example, I think one of the risks with a lot of performance indicators that ports are now tasked with meeting, such as rate of return indicators, is that they can take the focus away from the key issue, which is the adequacy of port services. And the rate of return is an important measure, but of course it shouldn't detract from the fact that ports do have a broader role. It is very important they provide a good level of service, and sometimes, of course, that may mean that the rate of return that they deliver is affected. It's not simply about the monetary financial return, it's about the quality of service that's delivered. And I think I've given you a quotation there from a paper published some years ago, which basically refers to the complexity of assessing the performance and adequacy of port services. There are many factors involved, but essentially it comes down to the quality of service provision, and this is a multifaceted phenomenon. Now, I came across this quotation from Viserod about the challenges facing 21st century seaports. And I think it's a little bit melodramatic, but I quote, modern ports bring both prosperity and problems. They bring trade and wealth, but at the same time they bring crushing, uncontrollable congestion of road and rail, costly construction and maintenance for landside infrastructure, enormous costs associated with dredging underwater channels and disposing of the dredged sediments, hot competition for an urban area's most valuable land on the waterfront, and an almost exquisite vulnerability to terrorist attack via the very containers that form the basis of modern trade and wealth. Now, as I said, that's a little bit melodramatic, particularly in front of this audience, but of course in the broader community, this is how ports are perceived very often. Congestion, risks, problems with dredging. And of course it's very important that the message gets across that there's always a trade-off, and if we want the value adding and the economic benefits from ports, then we have to accept some trade-offs in other areas. Now, you're all very well aware, probably better than I, of the challenges you face as port managers. Increasing vessel size, well, there's nothing new about that in a sense. It's been going on since at least the 1950s. Space for cargo handling and storage. This is a desperate problem in many ports, particularly in terms of providing also the landside access, the congestion on the road and rail links, or on the road links in particular. And it's very interesting to see that many ports are now starting to basically say, well, let's move towards reclamation. It's certainly worked in the aviation industry, Hong Kong Airport, for example, and so we're seeing increasingly ports looking at this option in order to provide more land area for cargo handling and storage. Congestion, yes, I think one of the things in the budget that has just been handed down was a recognition, for instance, of this problem, at least in the case of Port Botany, which has received some funding for improving its transport links. Vertical integration, ports of course are part of intermodal chains, and we can't just optimise the port, we need to optimise the system as a whole. Environmental concerns, these are obviously a pressing issue, particularly where ports are located close to urban areas. Climate change is another factor, of course, that ports and other coastal operations are having to allow for and plan for. Security. Security, obviously, post 9/11 is also another issue of concern. And also, of course, institutional and governance issues, including regulation and coordination. And in fact, the focus of my talk today is going to be on this latter area, focusing on the institutional and governance issues, port regulation, coordination of port planning. But I think I wanted to just paint this general picture of the enormous challenges facing 21st century seaports. It's a tough job being a port manager, I think. This table was taken from a World Bank publication, and I think it's interesting because it shows the competitive landscape that ports face. But the key issue, I think, particularly in Australia, is not so much the horizontal links, but more the vertical ones, in the sense that, correction, it's more the horizontal links rather than the vertical ones, in the sense that the threat of new entrants and the potential for global substitutes is obviously limited in the Australian context. And the main issues, of course, are the potential rivalries between different providers, the influence of bargaining power of users, and of course the bargaining power of service providers. And so the balance in the competitive landscape is obviously probably different from that facing many European ports. Trade facilitation is a key issue. As I said, it can be very narrowly defined as a reduction in trade costs. And it's important to remember that there's a broader context to this. It's even part of the Doha agenda under the World Trade Organization, although as everyone's probably aware, this is rather stalled at the moment. But the key point is that trade costs are determined not only by distance, economies of scale and commodity characteristics, but also by the quality of the infrastructure and the institutions. Traditionally, most of the focus in port development has been on hard infrastructure, that is providing the channels, the berths and the other associated infrastructure. And we all know that this is costly, it's lumpy, you have to do big lumps of investment. And obviously it's a very important aspect of trade facilitation. But modern research has increasingly emphasised too the importance of the so-called soft infrastructure, which has already been alluded to this morning. And that of course includes the institutions of governance, the port authorities themselves for example, customs, rule of law, and importantly the issue of regulation as well. So we need to have a broader focus then if we're going to evaluate the logistical performance of ports. I thought it might be interesting to give some of the international statistics on logistics performance and ports on Australian ports. And so I have a table here from the World Bank. Now, there are a number of indicators that the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, for example, produce indicators of global performance statistics. There are a few issues with the methodologies, but let's put those to one side for a moment. They do give a picture of performance, and it does present an image of Australian logistics to the outside world. Well, in 2012, Australia ranked 18th overall. Top in world logistics was Germany, second was Singapore. And I've included in that table a few comparative countries. So you can see, for instance, if you look at the aggregate data, I'm pleased to see that we slightly pipped New Zealand, and we're certainly well ahead of China and also India. But we're a little bit behind Canada, which is only a small amount, but Canada I thought would be a good comparator in terms of relative performance. But also we're a long way behind the leaders, Singapore. And of course the UK is now up there as well as a strong performer. If we look at the quality of port infrastructure, you can see Australia there is the blue line, and this gives a picture of change over time in the measure of quality of port infrastructure, and this is derived from the World Economic Forum Global Competitive Index. So if we look at 2012-2013, Australia's rank was 5.1, compared, for instance, to Canada 5.7, Singapore 6.8, and the UK 5.8. So what's very interesting here is we can see the trend over time. Australia has been doing reasonably well, but obviously there is still a considerable scope for improvement. The World Economic Forum ranked Australia 17th out of 132 countries overall, but in transport we rated 27th, and they said that maritime transport, and I quote, is most worrisome of these, especially given the country's remoteness. And in terms of seaport infrastructure, the World Economic Forum's index ranked us as only 37th. So clearly the rest of the world thinks that we've got a lot of work to do in terms of improving the quality of our transport infrastructure. Interestingly, you can see, for example, from the table that the United Kingdom has improved its performance in recent times, which suggests, of course, that the privatised system there is working well for it. But I'll come back to that point in a moment. Around the world, there are basically these three major categories of port authorities. You've got the comprehensive port authority, where the state or private owner invests in and operates all infrastructure and large terminals, and this is relatively rare with the exception of the United Kingdom. Then there's the concept of the Tull port, where the Port Authority provides the infrastructure and cargo equipment, but is operated by private companies. That's relatively rare. The most common is the concept of the landlord port, certainly most common here in Australia, where the Port Authority provides the infrastructure, but private companies invest in and operate cargo handling terminals. And this is increasingly the dominant form. However, of course, as we've seen, the landlord role is quite demanding. It's not only the costliness of the infrastructure, but it's also the need to coordinate road and rail logistics as well, and also the storage issues as well, and interaction with, in many cases, metropolitan areas. So the landlord role is actually a very complex one if performed effectively. Until relatively recently, the dominant Australian model was public ownership, with ports acting as landlords and strategic managers subject to statutory and governmental oversight. And traditionally, the main rationale for public ownership is that ports have natural monopoly power, they can generate significant externalities, and that traditionally was regarded, under certainly a kind of Anglo-Saxon model, as an argument for public ownership. On the other hand, of course, we've seen increasingly a trend in recent years towards privatisation, including, and the arguments here include increasing efficiency, raising revenue, controlling the growth of state debt, and promoting competition. In Australia, as I said, we've basically tended to favour public ownership until relatively recently. Pioneers were Geelong and Portland in '96 and the Port of Adelaide in 2001. It's very interesting, of course, that Flinders Ports, which operates South Australian ports, is diversifying in many respects. For instance, Flinders Logistics has done very well in terms of providing transshipping facilities, and it's got this misting system which is making significant market gains. And so we see an example here of a private operator that's actually proven to be quite innovative. But this is, of course, not the only model, and there's a lot of evidence to say that publicly owned ports can also operate efficiently and be innovative. And I think we've seen that example, we're seeing that example with the approach of the Port of Dampier. Now, reforming ports is a very complex process. To use a bit of academic jargon, it's path dependent. It means that there's a lot of lock-in from existing arrangements, governance and institutional arrangements, and sometimes it can be quite difficult to change them. And in the past, this inertia has been caused by a number of factors: the monopoly power exercised by the trade unions, particularly, of course, the MUA, the concentrated market structure that we've had, particularly container operations characterised by duopoly, although of course this is changing where third operators are now coming in a number of ports. And also the management of practices of port authorities before the reforms of the 1980s were generally regarded as a little bit antiquated and perhaps not as flexible as was required. So for a number of reasons, change on the waterfront in Australia has often been very slow and tortuous. And it's really taken some major trigger point to create change. For example, in the 1980s, change occurred as a result of the microeconomic reform strategy, which was adopted, which was, of course, a broad approach for the Australian economy, but ports were swept along in that process of microeconomic reform. And so we had processes of commercialisation of port authorities, corporatisation, and, in one or two cases, privatisation. So, of course, the issue is, where do we go from there? Do we go further down the track of privatisation, or do we concentrate on improving the existing ownership structures? Okay, this chart is a very partial snapshot of change on the Australian waterfront from about 1990 up until the end of, up until last year, and it's looking at trends in container crane rates, which, as you know, is only a partial indicator of port performance. But I think the chart shows quite dramatically the two major reform waves that occurred in the ports industry. There was the first major wave of the 1980s, which resulted in substantial increases in performance, around about 43% if you take the lowest point of the curve to the peak. Then you can see things plateaued off, and then we had the second wave, the Reece-Corrigan reforms, which led to another substantial improvement in operations, and then again a plateauing, and with a slight tendency to increase in the last few years. And this then fits this model, this notion of change, as being something that isn't really incremental. In fact, it's relied on major trigger points and turning points, and so you get a jump due to some major trigger, then a plateauing out, and then possibly another jump if there's another trigger point in the future. And so the issue for us now, of course, is where do we go in terms of future trigger points and future change patterns. And obviously one of the options that currently is being addressed is the increasing privatisation, for example, as one way of delivering further reforms. Now, this table draws on some research by American researchers, and what they did was they tried to compare port efficiency relative to Rotterdam, which of course is generally acknowledged as one of the world's most efficient ports. And if we look at the left-hand column, efficiency relative to Rotterdam, if it's a negative there, it means that the ports are more efficient than Rotterdam. So Zeebrugge, Osaka were more efficient. And where it's positive in that left column, it means that the ports are less efficient. And obviously, the larger the percent, the more inefficient they are relative to Rotterdam. And so you can see Melbourne, for example, 16.4%, Sydney about 18%, less efficient than Rotterdam, according to this data. This was based on 1991-93. There's the Port of Windsor at the bottom, about the worst performer, and of course Windsor is very interesting. I was asking Fred Affleck about it just before the conference started, and of course it's very unusual. It's a river port, very small, and so probably a bit of an outlier. But interestingly, you can see Shanghai, for example, relatively inefficient compared to Rotterdam, despite all the massive investment that's gone into Chinese ports, in fact, in recent times. And in fact, that's part of a broader picture. That original graph I showed that compared the trend over time in efficiency from the World Economic Forum showed that Chinese ports were still relatively inefficient, which suggests that investment is important, but I think there's a need to focus on the institutional side, the soft side, as it were, the institutions, the management, the customs, the regulations, and so on, which suggests that the Chinese have a bit more work to do in that regard. The second column is particularly interesting because it shows change over time from the early 90s to 2001-2003. And you can see the effects of the change that occurred in Australian ports, where the positive sign shows an increase in efficiency relative to Rotterdam. So by 2001-2003, Melbourne had increased performance 26% relative to Rotterdam, and Sydney about 17%. A negative in that column, like Osaka, means its performance deteriorated relative to Rotterdam. So basically that's good news. It's really another benchmark, as it were, or of evidence of the improvements that occurred in Australian ports as a result of the microeconomic reforms of that period. Okay, the future. What we're seeing, of course, is what could be described as a new wave of privatisation, beginning with the Port of Brisbane. More recently this year, of course, the successful conclusion of privatisation of Port Botany and Port Kembla. There's been discussion of Melbourne possibly going down the privatisation route. In Western Australia, we're seeing, as was mentioned earlier this morning, amalgamations, but the question of privatisation is unclear. I think the government's current position is that West Australian ports will not be privatised and they will continue in public ownership. In Tasmania, there's been amalgamation to Tasports, and of course some discussion about the success of that following an Auditor General's review of that. And the Northern Territory, I'm not aware of any major pressure for change there. In 2012, Michael Deegan, who's the National Infrastructure Coordinator, made a speech in which he was quite critical of the performance of Australia's ports, arguing that none of the leading ports was generating a return on assets equivalent to the risk-free rate. His advocacy was for privatisation, and I quote, "Our ports demand drive, leadership and focus on performance." Well, I think he should probably visit Western Australia more often, because I think there's some pretty dynamic leadership here. But again, I think that's the point, that an overdue focus on rates of return, financial rates of return, doesn't capture the full economic benefits of a port to a community, the full economic contribution. And if we're losing a broader concept of a gateway port, then we need to be very careful about simply dismissing performance on the basis of a financial return indicator. I'm not saying they're unimportant, they are important, but they're only one performance indicator and shouldn't be taken in isolation. Interestingly, privatisation is not for everyone. Whoops, got ahead of myself there. The Virginia Port Authority recently, this year in fact, rejected privatisation of their operating arm, Virginia International Terminals. There was a move to restructure it into a private operation. But the Virginia Port Authority rejected this, and I quote, we believe today's decision by the VPA Board of Commissioners to build upon our existing model, rather than turning a port monopoly over to private interests, will position Virginia's ports for even greater success. And this was Mr. R. Moy, who's speaking for the Virginia Maritime Association, and that was published in the Washington Post in March of this year. So across the globe, we shouldn't say that everywhere there's this overwhelming move towards privatisation. And I think what that reflects is the fact that there is actually no ideal model. A very interesting paper that was published earlier this year, sorry I'm getting a call, okay, shows that there's no one model that's ideal. And I think the point is that publicly owned ports can be managed efficiently. There are risks with privatisation. Alfred Baird, for example, said that there's a risk of them being sweated for financial return and the potential underinvestment in infrastructure. So it's not competition rather than ownership is probably the key to efficiency. The coordination challenge is a very important one in ports, and I won't go and read that quotation, but that's a very old one. But basically, the argument is that a lot of the problems of coordination are climaxed on the wharves, and they were in the 1950s, and it's still true today. So we need a whole of supply chain approach to planning, and there's a possible role there for a regional or national body. The National Ports Plan, of course, our first attempt to produce one in Australia. The UK and New Zealand governments tried in the 1960s coordinated national port planning bodies. They didn't work. One of the main reasons was actually large opposition or strong opposition from independent port authorities like the then Port of London Authority and the Liverpool Port Authority that resented any overall imposition on their activities. And so those activities didn't work. And I think the National Port Plan to work will have to provide incentives for good planning by the states. So basically, of course, it comes down to money in the long run. But I think that given Australia's geography, a more regional, localised approach may be more effective. Okay, again, because I'm short of time, I'm not going to dwell on this, but regulation is a major issue for ports. We all know that if it's not done well, it can cause problems, and there's those delays on those East Coast bulk handling ports were possibly, to some degree, a reflection of inadequate regulation. We have a complex regulatory environment with differences between the states. Arguably, the trend towards privatisation is prima facie creating a greater need for independent regulation, and particularly where we're getting evidence of cross-ownership, increasing market power. You know, two of the private equity funds in the New South Wales consortium are also shareholders in Q Port Holdings in Brisbane. So there is a need for regulation, there is a need for oversight, irrespective of whether it's a publicly owned port or a privately owned port, but arguably the case for regulation is stronger if it's privately owned. This was a report card from Access Economics a few years ago now, which gave South Australia a very good rating and the rest of us a pretty lousy rating. And Fred Affleck and I wrote a paper actually looking at the performance of West Australian ports and arguing that, in fact, the West Australian model was working very well, and that these sort of report cards gave a very inadequate picture. Going on quickly, regulation of South Australian ports, my argument there is basically it's just CPI indexing, which provides little incentive for efficiency improvements. And so it's a very soft or light-handed approach to regulation. Okay, conclusions. International benchmarking shows there is scope to improve our performance, our logistics performance. We're not amongst the top performers, but clearly we're also not amongst the bottom performers. And there's evidence of a lot of improvement since the 1980s. Arguably, the process has stalled, the reform process has stalled. Whichever way we go, I think it needs to be clear that there's no ideal model. Different models can work. National port plans can be useful, but there are problems with their implementation. They haven't worked well, for instance, in the UK when they were tried many years ago. Regulation is a major issue, particularly with increasing privatisation of ports. And I think here there might be scope for a possible specialised national regulator so that we do have some standardisation in approaches between the states. As to the future, obviously I think that perhaps we're going to possibly see a more nuanced wave of privatisation. Ports have to grapple with the coordination challenge and the broader concept of the gateway. And I think the value of the Port of Dampier's approach is it does broaden the focus beyond rates of return. It looks at the port as part of the overall transport chain, and also in terms of the interconnections between the ports and the communities. So it's important, of course, that our ports are gateways, that they're open gateways, they're not congested and clogged gateways. And obviously, to ensure that's the case in the future, there are many challenges ahead for port managers and port authorities. So thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm. And we move now to a bigger picture of the pattern of port development and shipping in other parts of the world. It's my pleasure to introduce our first international keynote. It will be presented by Dr. Asaf Ashar, the research professor with the National Ports and Waterways Initiative of the University of New Orleans. Dr. Ashar's extensive international research ranges from Israel to the UK, Panama, and the future of American ports. A warm welcome, please, for Dr. Asaf Ashar.
Good morning. I'm sorry that I'm encroaching on your break, but nevertheless I have 40 minutes of presentation, so bear with me. I'll take you not a long but perhaps a very broad journey. Okay, who am I? As you heard, I'm with the National Ports and Waterways Institute. We are a small group, relatively small, with a couple of offices in New Orleans and Washington, D.C., and Baton Rouge, Louisiana, which is the capital of the state of Louisiana. And as you see, the first jump, what I am going to address is what I call evolutionary perspective, which means I want to take you to a small journey, starting a little bit in the past and going all the way to the future. Let's start, agenda. As you see, I have some kind of extensive agenda, starting with the process. Maybe let me a little bit put you in a bit of introduction. I'm focusing on liner shipping, containerization, simply because this is the biggest game in ports and shipping in the world. I know that you are focusing on bulk. You have a little bit of containers here, but the main change in the world was in containerization, and it started in the US. We'll see it. So the first item is containerization. I'll talk about evolution, revolutions. We like revolutions, of course, and I will talk about this interaction between two sectors, the main two sectors, the shipping, the ship, and the port. So let's start how it began. What you see here is the beginning of century process of handling in the port of New Orleans. As you see, mechanization is very simple, by hand. The vertical transportation was by a hand cart. The lifting was by a pulley. Now, the cargo unit was single. There was a bag and so on. And the facility was a transit shed facing very close to the vessel, because the horizontal transport was by hand cart. And another, perhaps, item to look at is that the dock itself was wooden, so the loading was very limited. This is how it began, break bulk handling. Now, in 1956, there was a guy by the name of Malcolm McLean. I happened to meet him once at the conference, early 90s. Was older guy. You know, I thought that I'm going to tackle a visionary fellow, change the entire world of shipping. No, he was a simple-minded guy. He was a trucker. He owned a small trucking company that used to go to the port of New York, waiting for hours, for days. So he thought maybe if we want to go, now the US is very large, divided into states. Every time you took a truck and cross from state to state, you had to get a different license plate. There was the issue of taxing, especially tax. And tax was always an incentive to a great revolution in the US. The US is based on perhaps tax policy, wrong tax policy. Otherwise there would be no US. And these guys refused to pay the tax. So he thought that if I'm going from New York to Houston, Texas, I have to cross maybe 10 states. Every time I cross, I have to pay somebody something. So if I go by water, I can save a lot of tax. So if somebody is telling you stories about efficiency, containerization, and so on, this is a secondary. The main issue is tax. So this guy took an old tanker, as you see, he converted it. He didn't touch the hull. He just strengthened the deck, and he took the trucks and divided into a box and a truck, and it was 35 feet, not 40, not 20 as we have today. Okay, and as you see it here, oh, sorry, slow. Okay, as you see it here, he took a construction crane in order to load and unload the containers. And the first containerized service started 1956. He called it Ideal, very nice, X. And it was only, as you see it, 58 containers. Containers were known before Malcolm McLean, i.e., he did not invent containerization. It's important to know. Boxes for handling cargo were used in the First World War, the Second World War. Basically, he bought the containers off the shelf. All the systems that we have now with the 4 holes and the spreader and so on was available. He was the first one to dare and putting it together. He sold his truck line, he bought the ship for a couple of $1 million, it was very cheap, strengthened the dock and started containerization, called it Sealand. Now, let's go to my theme here, which is how the industry developed and how will it further develop. So what I see here, as you see by the heading, there are 2 elements here. There are first evolution, as you see it here, the size. Professor Tull already addressed it. Everything is growing because of scale economy. So we talked about the 2 components, the port and the ship, both of them were growing. Now, in parallel, okay, there were what I call 4 revolutions in the scope of the system. The first revolution is the containerization itself, i.e., it was only focusing on one link in the transportation chain between the shore and the ship-to-shore transfer. Containers instead of all the bunch of bags that you have seen before. The second one was expansion, first expansion of containerization to the inland, and we look at it, what we call intermodalism. The third one was some kind of a bold idea to tie ships to ships or transshipment, and the fourth one is the theme of my presentation here, the future, what I call the global grid. Let's look at it again. So we have 2 parallel processes. On one side, we have this evolution. Everything is growing in size, both ships and ports. Now we have some kind of a series of revolutions where the system expands itself from the limited link at the port to the entire world. As you see, the first involved containerization, second intermodalism, basically ship to rail. The third is ship-to-ship transshipment, and the fourth, what I see in the future, is taking the entire system and mold it in some kind of what I call a global grid. And here I have, okay, it's not, as you see, I don't know why it's not working well. Before we have disjointed some kind of a plumbing system. When the fourth revolution, if it comes, it will become some kind of an integrated system whereby we'll have total connectivity. We'll be able to go from any place to every place in the globe. Okay, we started talking about containerization. We already addressed it. You saw the vessel, the first ship, and so on. What about the rail? It's interesting because the US is some kind of unique in this issue of intermodalism. What you see here is a double-stack train system. Now, what we have here, we connected rail cars into what we call skeleton. And what we have here is 5 articulated cars. Each of them is double-stack. Okay, and if you see, the cars are sitting very, very low. It's basically this type of structure. So you save on the height, you increase safety. Now, the length and the size of this train is also unusual. We are talking about 10,000 trailing ton, and as you see it here, 3 kilometers plus. I think that the largest trains can reach 3.5 kilometers and can carry, as you see here, I have seen up to 550 TEUs. A train carrying 550 TEUs. It's like a ship. Now, a comparison with Europe, as you see, it's only 2,000 tons and 100 TEUs, very, very short train. And most important, we invented the so-called land bridge. We can cross the US 5,000 kilometers with the same train set, which means I was once a guest of the head of the Port Authority of New York. We looked through the window and we saw a container, and the guy was complaining that most of the containers that coming to New York do not come through the Port of New York. They come through the Port of Los Angeles. 2/3 of the population of the US is east of the Mississippi River. Most of the trade of the US, like you, is with Asia. Most of the trade is served through the West Coast by trains like this. Okay? Now, perhaps the last unknown issue, some kind of a small secret, is that in the US we invented another type of containers, which we call domestic container. If you look at the containers that I put on the train here, I didn't put it, but the containers are 53 feet. Okay, it's not the regular 20 and 40. In America, only 5 years ago, we introduced a totally new type of containers, domestic, limited to America, to the US landmass. What is the whole idea? The length of trucks is 53 feet. Take advantage of them, and you can put 340s into 2 53s domestic. So you increase the size of the container by 50%, and the most important issue, containers are part of the ship. So if you send a container, say from Los Angeles to New York, many times it has to go back empty all the way, or to Chicago. Domestic container is captive. So you can take it from LA to Chicago, down to New Orleans, then to Atlanta. There is no empty backhaul. Now, if you look at my bio, I was a team leader for the Panama Canal expansion study. And I'll address it in a minute or two. And when we were looking at the issue, forecast, what will be the future, you know, we used to joke that Panama Panama Canal is expanding every 100 years. The previous one was in 1913. The original plan was to open the canal, the new canal now, 100 years and so on. So we were asked to do a 100-year forecast. So we looked at the model of evolution and whatever, and we missed in a big way all the issue of domestic containers. They were not there. You cannot forecast. Let's move on. Now, the ships, the size of the ship. Okay, the largest ship, still not in operation, probably will be in operation next month, is Maersk Triple E. Okay, Maersk Triple E is 18,000 TEUs. Now, what are the unique features of the vessel? First, I think that I can point here. It's the first container vessel to have twin screws. Twin screws are more expensive, provide you with more maneuverability. We should not get into it, but it's a unique. Second, you have a U shape. It's almost square, like box, almost like bulk ships. Now, another design, feature design, is a two-island, which means they separate the house and the machinery room, the engine room. Two hulls. The fourth, let's leave the... But more important, that before that we had a E-class, supposedly. This is a Triple E, which has only 15,500 TEUs. This one is some kind of a expansion on it, and the perhaps comparison is very interesting, because what you see, that what they did, they basically increase the width by another row of containers. They decrease the speed. The result of it, if you look, the most important item here is a kilowatt. The largest ship is taking a smaller engine, efficiency. Now, cost. Of course, you go scale economy in order to reduce the cost. The cost of each of this type of vessel is 190 million, which reduce the cost per slot, the most important item, to 10,000. Also, let's continue better. It's slow, I'm sorry, the response. I should point it to somewhere. Okay. Now, Maersk, you know, is a Danish company, is the largest shipping in the world, that has a very high labor cost and probably provide a very high quality service. So they saw that by going scale economy, they can beat the world. However, just now, recently, another Chinese line, China Shipping, came with the same design, but if you look at the cost, instead of 190 million per piece, it's 140 million. So despite the scale economy, whatever you do, somebody can beat you, depends on timing. Now, the issue of cost, slot cost. What you see, there was a reduction. If you go through the scale economy, if you go from a vessel of 6,000 to a traditional vessel, you can cut $350 per TEU. And we saw it was a result of the larger scale and the hull and the engine and whatever, and the slow steaming, very important. We used to go 25, 26. You know, the highest speed that liner shipping was designed to go was 27. If you look at ships, say 5 or so years ago, Engine came with a series of ships designed to go 27 knots. Now, typical speed is about 18 knots, and some of them are going now super slow, almost like bulker, 14 knots, because of the cost of fuel. Now, as you see, the line here is very important, because you see cost and revenue, And it means that if you want to play, the largest trade route, we'll see it in a second, is between Asia and Europe. And if you want to be a player on this route, first you have to come up with big ships. Now, and if you come with big ships like Maersk or CSCL, you need 10 of them in order to provide a weekly service, which means $1.4 billion investment, which means that there is a very high entry barrier now in liner shipping. Now, the famous story about the growth of vessels. Let's look at a couple of interesting points. The Panamax, as you see it here, 5,000 TEU, went, now we'll talk a little bit about Panama Canal. The expansion of the Panama Canal will introduce what we call new Panamax. And as you see, from 5 to 13,200 is 1 to 2.2. So there is a growth in ship size of 2.2. Now, my forecast is that the ultimate size of container ship will reach what we call the Malacca Max. The largest trade route on Earth is between Asia and Europe, and it is being constricted by the Malacca Max. The Malacca Max can reach up to 30,000, and again you have a jump of 1.23. So you see, starting with the 58 containers of Malcolm McLean, and probably within 50 or 60 years, we will reach to 30,000. Here is a scale economy at its best. Now, we talked about this tango, the duo. Okay, so we have ships are coming, or shipping line are coming with larger ships, and they put some kind of a pressure on ports to handle them. Okay, now there is a big question: who is leading? You know, are we ports led by ships, or maybe we are to be blamed because we are providing with all this infrastructure which invites them, because we want to beat our competitor to come with larger ships. And then the most important issue: who pays? So who pays? Of course, who pays? The public, of course. So. Either you pay through infrastructure cost or through freight or whatever, but eventually it is being expressed in the cost of transportation. So the issue of the ship versus port, especially in containers, especially in public ports. The professor before me mentioned Virginia, for example. Virginia Port Authority in the US that basically refused to sell itself about a month ago. And he mentioned the issue, and they gave the very noble argument that they don't want to create a private monopoly. They simply forgot to change that about 200 miles away there's an equally large port by the name of Baltimore. And there's no monopolistic setting. There is very, very harsh competition. There is, again, I believe, an issue of organization that doesn't want to basically diffuse itself. They want to stay there in action. So, coming to the basic economics here. So what we have here, we have two elements. If we look at the total, what we call system cost, we have first, okay, we have the rising, sorry, the declining scale, okay, economics of the ship. Maybe I should put it here. If you look at the cost of ships, obviously the ships is getting larger. The cost of shipping, as I showed before, is getting down. But at some point, the cost curve becomes parallel. There's no more scale economy. Now, on the other hand, if you look at the port, the other element, when you start digging, it's not only deeper channels. You have to have, you know, a larger turning basin. We visited Fremantle and we saw the turning of Maersk vessel. It was very, very tight. And if you get a bigger vessel, what do? Who is going to foot the cost? And the cost, you know, if you are familiar with the engineering environment, the more you dig, the quicker it feels. There's no end to it. So on one hand, you have flattening scale economy for the ships. On the other hand, you have exponential rise in the cost of the port. So where is the optimum? If you look at the red line, okay, supposedly if you put the two of them together, you reach the so-called sweet point. Where is it? Where is the optimum? Nobody knows. My guess would be that it will be far away from the 30,000 TEUs that the ship will probably reach, probably around the 15. But we have an environment, we have two competing bodies, and let's see where the equilibrium be. Sorry, there's no response here. Good. Okay, you see now the fleet composition. As you see, new buildings are all concentrated down there in the 72% of the ships that are built now are 12,000 TEUs and larger. Now, what will happen with all these ships? First, why? It's obviously that you would like to have the largest and the most economical ship. But there is another item. If you are a shipping line, and if you are going to a shipbuilding program, you probably go for the larger ships to put it on the major trade. As a result of it, and the major trade is Asia-Europe. Now, the smaller ships, ships are like real estate. They never die. Okay, all the stories that you hear about economic life, nothing. There are ships, you know, I worked in Indonesia. They were taking a Japanese yacht and turning them into container ships. Some of them were, I don't know what, 60 years old or 50 years old. Ships do not die if you maintain them. It's just a real estate. So you have to find new tenants. So you move it to another trade. We call it cascade effect. So you take the largest 18,000 and you put them on Asia-Europe. Then the previous 10,000, you put it here, I put supposedly Asia-America. Then Europe-America, and eventually, it will come to secondary trades, don't be offended, like Australia. Okay, so what will happen that suddenly, not that the trade will grow here. The trade, containerized trade, is not growing by far. You know, you will see in a second, 3, 4, 5%. But unfortunately, they will dump on you, the big ships. So again, in a tango, this shipping line will come to the port authority and will tell you a nice story. You know, we want to introduce you with the biggest, the modern, the most efficient ships. However, you have to invest in a channel load. Okay, so there is some kind of a dumping process. And it's common to every port and every... I have not seen in my life a port authority that will say no to a shipping line. Okay. So, fleet composition, I'm sorry about it. Oh, okay. We move to the second item, which is a trade itself. Now, the world trade. The main trades are east-west. You see, the largest is, by the way, the largest is not between Asia and Europe, but intra-Asia. Asia has a lot of countries which are trading among themselves. It's the largest trade, it's a short trade. As you see it here, it's larger than Asia-Europe. The third one is Asia-North America. Now, to give you some kind of perspective, the Australian trade is only 5.4 million TEUs. As you know it better than I, you shifted from the long deep sea trades to Europe and to US. Mainly you are focusing on Asia, so perhaps in the future you will be included in the intra-Asia. Now, you are also, your services are served or going, your main destination is either Singapore if you want to go to Europe, so transshipment, or Hong Kong if you want to go to the US. Now, as you see down there, the forecast, world forecast for trade is about 5 or 6%. So, however, it's a bumpy road, as you see. First, the world is not growing at the same rate. You have, as you see it here, the Americas are growing. I'm talking about South America, the other Americas here. And you have Asia Pacific is growing on one hand. On the other hand, you see, for example, a low growth area, Western Europe or so on. Now, generally, the forecast is related to the GDP because containers is manufactured goods. And usually, as you see it here, is about 2 times the GDP. So you can expect perhaps long term at a 5 to 6%. Now, as I told you before, it will be a bumpy road because if you see here, the trade is moving with the world economy. You have a little bit of recession. The first thing that you cut is on import. Import is a driver. So you have big fluctuation. Okay, now what are the trends? I hope it will come finally. Okay, what do you see generally? You know, the trends that drive this containerized trade. First, the long term, who knows what is the long term, will be somewhere in a 5 to 6%. Now, what are the pluses? What are the minus? The minus first is aging. Population is aging. We do not consume too much. We have enough. Okay, there is environmental. There is ideological also issues. There is another trend that you are not familiar with it, what we call near sourcing. The US supposedly is tired of Asia. Same thing with Europe. They want to bring manufacturing closer to the destination, also based on environmental issues. For example, we see industries moving from China to Mexico. Okay, so suddenly there's less maritime trade. The third issue is also continued conversion of bulk to containers. I have seen in Brazil sugar going in containers. And at one time I saw in Colombia coal, okay, metallurgic coal going into containers. The container ships, the newer container ships are so large, they have such a scale economy, and they have a huge backhaul that they can suck in still a lot of bulk. So you have plus and minuses. Panama Canal. I'm going to talk now about a couple of projects that may change the face of international shipping. Panama Canal, as you see it here, it's a major hub of trade. But the main trade of Panama Canal is a red one, okay, between China and US East Coast. As I told you, most of the population of the US is here. So you have many services that cross the canal and go, say, to New York. In competition, if you look at the blue one, going to Los Angeles and crossing the US by rail. It's a big trade-off. Big competition between two routes. One of them is faster via rail and more expensive. The other one is slower, all water, going through the canal. The other, by the way, route is here, the blue one. Now, as I told you, I happen to be on the study team that looked at the expansion of the Panama Canal in the year 2000. There were many ideas. One of them was, by the way, to do a sea level canal. You know, Panama Canal, Panama is very narrow. There's a small mountain range in the middle of it. And there is a lake. So you climb to the lake and you go down, vice versa. So you have a series of locks. You climb up, you climb down. Panamanian thought it was a Japanese advice, I don't know, maybe they should go to a sea level canal. They want to bomb the entire mountain range. The world, of course, started to jump. So eventually they decided to go to a new set of locks. Now, why there is a need for a new set of locks? First, capacity. You know, the number of transit was reaching the limit. But more important to them was the size of the ship. The Panamex was about 4.5 to 5,000 TEUs. Ships, even in the year 2000 or so, started to reach 6, 7, 8,000 TEUs. There was an issue, as I put it here, defensive decision, which means Panama Canal was the only game in town in Panama. There's nothing in Panama. Very small country, no natural resource. They have only one resource, the canal. So we were trying to do some kind of a forecast, how much will go, what will be, the revenue. We talked about return on public investment and so on. Everything was somewhat negative. But they asked us, what is your recommendation? We said, do it. Because if you do not do it, Panama will degenerate. That was a key issue. And lo and behold, now Panama is going to be expanded probably in the year 2015. And there is another route to reach the US, which the Panamanian did not put it here, of course, but it's going through Suez Canal. And the Suez Canal is not limited because there are no locks, it's a seawater. So because of the scale economy, 50% of the services, the red services, the bread and butter of the Panama Canal has already moved to the Suez route, showing you the value of defensive decision. If they would not expand, everything almost will be moving. Now, just technically, as you see it, the size of the ship increased, as you saw, from 5 to 13. Now, the system is different. Instead of having opening gates like this, they have some kind of a sliding gates. Perhaps moving, you have to move the ships inside the locks. They used to have locomotives, now they are going to tugboats. There's another issue which I'll show you here, which is, again, I'm sorry. What you see here is water preservation. The real limitation, every time you do locking, you have to spend some water. And the watershed of Panama is limited. So the real limitation on their capacity is not enough water. And it happens, I don't know if somebody here is familiar with shipping, that in some dry season, the draft of Panama Canal is reduced. So they came with a new technology where you have some kind of a preservation pools, which obviously increase the cost by much, but they had no other option. Now, the Panama Canal itself will come. Good. Panama Canal itself doesn't generate much economic impact. What do you have? A couple of pilots? My wife and I visited once Panama, and they took us to the lock. And a lock master, very important guy, all that he does now, press a button, and then the locks open. So we got a certificate of a lock master because we pushed the button. So Panama Canal itself, it doesn't generate jobs, and they know it. The jobs are generated by the port around the canal, as you see it here. Now, and these ports are not involved, they are not gateway ports. They do not bring containers to the Panama itself. Panama is 1.3 million people or so on. All the activity, most activity, all the activity is transshipment, ship to ship. So Panama is what we call pure transshipment ports, with a canal. If there were no canal there will be no ports. Now, once you have the port, look around you. What are the activities that are generated? You have value added. A Caterpillar, for example, put a big assembly plant. They bring all the pieces there and they renovate and rehabilitate it and they send to South America. You have wineries, some kind of a storage. So we have here this, some kind of a layered structure. You have the canal. Canal itself doesn't generate anything. You have the ports, which do transshipment, generate a lot of jobs, thousands of people, and around the port, this is the economic muscles there, the banks, the logistic, and so on, which is typical. I'm waiting, sorry. Okay, now, the Panamanian obviously would like to see all the transshipment at their ports. However, what they want to see is to see the big ship you know, the new Panamex of 13.5 coming to Panama. And there will be a big transshipment, and a smaller ship will go, say, to Savannah, Virginia, New York. However, again, in the forecast, there was a little bit of misunderstanding, because if you want to transship the US, the transshipment point should be closer to the US. So there is a big question mark now about the future of transshipment in the canal. They didn't realize that in order to transship the US, the whole idea is that supposedly New York and Virginia and the rest of the US are limited in terms of their ability to handle largest ships. So perhaps instead of having larger ships coming to the US, there will be transshipment and the US will be feedered. The question is where to do the feedering. The Panamanian, in their forecast, you saw it before, thought that the typical natural point will be in Panama. They forgot that there is competition also for pure transshipment port. For example, if you look at Jamaica, Kingston, Jamaica is a pure transshipment port close to the US. They got the World Bank now. They are building huge facility because of the canal. So it's not a very easy game. Let's move to the industry itself. You know, what I want to show you, I see that your face, you know, a little bit tired of it. But what I want to show here that between supply and demand, there's some kind of a big difference. A shipping line are pushing ahead. They are building ships because of competition. On the other hand, demand is lagging. So we had here a big crisis in 2009, and another crisis is looming now in 2014. As you see, what I put it here, there is a very safe way to self-destruction here. So if you read it, you know, all the big shipping lines are getting together. They want to reduce capacity because everybody is aware that we are going into disaster. Now, another perhaps small observation here is that the name of the game has changed because of the fuel cost. Went from $200 to $600. If you see it here, the dead bottom, okay, the voyage cost, because of the cost of fuel is so high. Before that, you know, you could have taken your vessel and go maybe 2/3 full and you can still make it. Now, because of the fuel, you have to cover your fuel cost. So the cost of operating now is very high. I'll go past it and go to port development, probably will be of more interest to you. Let's go to the US a little bit. You know, the largest port system in the US is what we call San Pedro Bay. You have two ports. One of them is Los Angeles, the other one is Long Beach. The difference between them, there's no difference. It's artificially divided between two municipalities. So here you have a case, nice case of Port Governor. Now, what we have here, we have, altogether, the two ports handle about 15 million TEUs. And what you see, we have terminalization. We have 14 different terminals of various size. Now, the question is, how do you grow the system? There's no land here. More than that, okay, we'll go to it maybe before that. There are two comments here, just to put it into perspective. Largest terminal that we have is APMT. APMT is obviously a subsidiary of Maersk. As you see, it's 2.1 kilometers, quite a large terminal, almost the largest in the US. Now, just to put it in perspective, the US is maybe a big country, but very small in terms of containerized trade. As you see, the largest port is Shanghai, and we'll talk about it in a bit, handling about 31.7 million. Second to Singapore. Hong Kong used to be the first one, then Singapore came, now Shanghai. And if you go all the way down, you see that Fremantle is only handling 0.6. So you have a whole range of ports. Now, how to grow the ports in the US? As you see, these are the new port ventures, and what we do basically, since there's no more land, we do consolidation of terminals. This is a famous, or the recent port project that we have. You have two terminals here. Both of them are 80 hectares. And the professor before me was talking about productivity. So the productivity, or call it efficiency or density, was 16,250 TUs per hectares. Now, the program is to put them together and to increase to 27, okay? The same terminals, putting into it $1.2 billion, will create one big terminal which will increase the capacity by a factor of almost 3. This is a trend in America. No land, no reclamation. No way to do reclamation in the US. Every time you want to introduce a new piece of land in Los Angeles, you have to provide a substitute. You have to buy the same amount of hectares somewhere else and give it back to the society. Okay, there is a famous case in the port of Tacoma, Washington. In the middle of the port, they dug a marshland and put a fence around it. It was some kind of a compensation for the environmentalists. So you go to the port, you see big containers on all sides. In the middle there is a small hole, marshland. Okay, so what we do, we go to technology, densification, and so on. Now, this is a terminal, as you see. Perhaps the main feature of it is what we call on-terminal intermodal yard. About 40% of the containers go from ship to rail, so it's important to have it here. There is a big debate, should it be on dock, near dock? You know, I saw in Sydney that you are going to some kind of intermodal yard, which is 18 kilometers away from the port, which is a no-no in the US, obviously. You will be killed by every environmentalist group. So we insist on dock. Now, more interesting here that if you look at the layout, everything is automated here. We have perpendicular automated stacking cranes. Now, other big projects in the world, Maslavka 2, supposedly the largest one. I will take a little bit of more time, okay? So, you see the old port, existing port, and the new port. What you see here is the traditional open sea reclamation, huge reclamation, 240 million cubic meters, unheard of, okay? And 11 kilometers of seawall, 1,000 hectares, huge project. This is the way it is being done. You see, it's open sea, it's minus 20 meters of depth. They pour a lot of reclaimed materials. Okay, now what they want to do, why do they need? You know, the Netherlands is a small country, 7-8 million people. They don't do much except for maybe tulips. Okay? Why do they need all these millions or whatever? Obviously, they have big ambitions. They want to be the gateway for North Europe. As usual, they forgot that there are other guys in Europe. As you see, there is a new port in Germany. The Germans say, hey, why should we go to the Netherlands? What do we owe them? We can have our own port. We are larger. We have more tax money to pay, to spend on ports. So it's another issue. Now, traditionally, again, we talked about privatization, so on. The Dutch like to create land. They don't have land, so typically it's a government investment. And more important, like in Panama, the port is the only game in town. So they realize the defensive policy. And you will find out in the port industry, the defensive decision is very common. If we do not build, the German will steal our bread. Taxpayer, give us money. Now, biggest port project in the world is China, as usual. Yangtze River, as you see it, crossing China. 400 million people are living along the Yangtze River, major trade route. As you see it here, 1.6 billion tons going there. By the way, the largest city is here, far, far, far away from the water, Chongqing. Now, there is a port in Shanghai, okay, but the port is a river port. Yangtze is a huge river, very, very hard to control. They built the Three Gorge. They were trying to deepen the river for years. As you see it here, They started from 10 meter, 12 meter. They want to reach to 15. They will never reach it. There's so much siltation, such a huge river. You know, the opening of the Yangtze is about 100 kilometers. There are islands there. You cannot control it. It's a big river. So what to do? They came with a bright idea. There were a bunch of islands. You can see them here, if I catch it. Sorry, cannot catch it. Oh, here, you see the islands here? A bunch of islands. Didn't belong even to the Shanghai. Shanghai is like a state there, like Western Australia. So they annexed them and they built a huge bridge to these islands, and you see what they want to do with the islands. So the largest port project now ongoing is Yangshan Island. You will hear it. And it will include 52 berths, 20 million TEUs. Again, a side story. I was there also involved in some kind of a critique. The central government, if you look at it, here, sorry. We're losing a lot of time because of it. There is a port, the BL3. If you look at it here, it's called Ningbo. Beautiful port. Lot of natural resources, bay, harbors. One problem with it, it doesn't belong to Shanghai. Shanghai said, like the Panamanian, like the guy in Rotterdam, it cannot be. It has to be Shanghai. So the federal government of China was again somewhat worried. We have a natural port here. Why not develop it? Why go with the bridges? Why go to an island? So they decided to get support from the outside. So they invited a group of experts, I happened to be there, to ask our opinion if there is any difference between Shanghai and Ningbo. We said no. If you go from Chongqing, 2,000 kilometers away, why do you care if you go to Shanghai or Ningbo? Why do you want to spend the billions of dollars? So there was a big debate, and happened to be that the Prime Minister of China at that time was a mayor, ex-mayor of Shanghai, and he said, Shanghai, this is it. So, okay, now you have close to you Port of Colombo. Again, what's interesting about it, it's a major, as you see, major development, and it is again a pure transshipment port. Now, we'll not get into all the technical, but as you see, 75 transshipment, they build on the idea that the port in India will always be limited. They will not be able to handle the big ships, or they will be inefficient, or who knows. However, the Indians are equally smart, and they are building a huge port in Chennai. So again, we come to the issue, why would the Sri Lankan, you know, they don't have much resources, will put in all this transshipment? The question is, what else can they do? Again, it's a big issue for them. So you see the same parallel theme coming everywhere. Now, I call it hub mania, as you see. The guys in Sri Lanka, okay, believe that Singapore will stay put, will not do anything. Of course, Singapore will continue to develop. There is another port, maybe we'll go to it here, perhaps 1, 2, 3. Okay, another huge port development is the Middle East, Abu Dhabi. As you see, it's interesting to see that they have 3 development stages. One of them is a marine terminal. The other one is backland support, immediate to the port. And the third one is huge, 36,000 hectares. So here you see your theme of gateway. The port, around the port, which is huge, by the way, as you see, there is an immediate industry and there is a huge industrial zone. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to just skip all this and go to the last one. Maybe one word about equipment. We are now going to the 40. I don't know if you've not seen it before. You can take 3 containers at once, bigger port. Now, automation, the nested, you know, driverless, you will probably have it with HPH here. Then one of them is Australian techniques, the autostrad, and the other one is the cassette, the lift cassette. There is another issue that I won't touch it. It doesn't come well. I'm sorry. I just want to go to the end of it. Algeciras, there was a whole issue. Algeciras, for example, is another transshipment port. And they again did not have land, so the issue was how to develop it. We came with the idea that if you are a pure transshipment, if you go from ship to ship, go to a floating terminal, as you see it here. Use barges, but the graphic didn't come well because of the mech, probably. Now, I want to show you just perhaps last slide. The whole idea is that if you do transshipment correctly, and if you use floating terminals, you are not limited by the size of ships. Then, for example, if you look at the liner rotation today, if you look at Maersk, you know, the big ships will be developed or deployed on the Asia-Europe service. In the Asia-Europe, you have two parts whereby the ships are double calling, going up and down, which is a major inefficiency. What you can do okay, you can introduce a service which I called the Singapore-Gibraltar service, a shuttle service of the big ships, which will be turned around in the two ports, and then will be feeder to both Asia and Europe. Now, you can do it with 5 ships, can be a daily conveyor, and probably can be the largest in the world. Longer future. Refuse to come, okay? Let me go through it, all of it, because it takes so long. Maybe, it will come. So what is the longer future? We saw before evolution, and so on. My forecast is the big ships will come. Maybe it will take a while, but probably next time you will invite me, we already see vessels approaching the 20 or 30,000 TEUs. It's somewhat unavoidable. Okay, the scale economy are so high in shipping that, and the competition between shipping lines is so tight that they have to introduce larger vessels. Now, there will be a change in the service patterns, something like what I have shown here, going directly with a big shuttle between Singapore and Gibraltar and spreading at the end, which means that there will be a role for some kind of a pure transshipment port, Singapore and Gibraltar. Now, my suggestion is that the port operation of this huge port will be based on a floating design, because if you go between ship to ship, there's no point in putting everything on land, digging it in, digging it out. You put it on barge, the barge goes between ships, okay? Now, what I see, and there's some other possibility, one of them is multiple container units. People were talking about for a long time. The US Army already introduced a sea shed for 3 FEUs. You can lift multiple container. And the last issue, perhaps, and this is probably concludes my presentation, that if all this comes to will somehow realized, we will have on one hand big ships, multiple container units, pure transshipment ports. What will happen, we'll have suddenly some kind of another transportation, shipping. A containerization that started by a small link, taking a box from the shore to the ship, now will be some kind of a tiered transportation system. The upper tier will be huge vessels going between floating ports, turning around there, conveyor type deal, and then spreading. Now, land-based ports, even your port will not be able to handle this type of ships because supposedly it will be based on barges. And if you go between 2 specialized ports, you can come with multiple container system. So evolution will probably go 1 notch above. There will be some kind of a new species of containerized shipping. So perhaps we finally closed the piping system. As you see, we'll be able to go from any place to every place in the world. This one I don't want to show you, and this basically concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Just join me here for a minute. Thank you very much, Dr. Ashar. Stay here, please. Just come and join me at the podium. We are way over time, and we do need to have a break. But among the many bold propositions put to us all this morning was the idea that it's a myth that there is an ideal model of port management, and that perhaps concentrating on competition and coordination and the long-term sustainable vision for a nation, you haven't yet given us your view of Western Australia's ports. So don't leave us without giving us your best shot to address those challenges of the morning.
I cannot probably talk intelligently about Western Australian port because I'm not familiar with them. But you talked about the issue of governance. And if you look at the US model, okay, as a professor before me pointed out, we have a whole variety. We are moving towards a landlord model, and the role of the port authority is being challenged more and more. One of the major issues, especially in the US, is investment. Every time you have to go, in the US, the access channels are responsibility of the federal government. Every time the Port of Virginia would like to deepen their port, the US Congress, okay, President Obama has to sign it. Think about it. Okay, we have, and the agency in charge is part of the Army, US Army. Okay, the largest public work project in the US was taming the Mississippi. And who could have done it but the US Army? So historically, they are in charge. Now, typically, to deepen a channel in the US takes between 20 and 30 years. Because once you have it, then every environmental group is jumping on you, the public. You have to show what we call benefit-cost ratio is larger than 1. So we're talking about ports. If you look at Savannah, the largest or the fastest growing port in the US is Savannah. But Savannah is located at an end of a relatively small river, Savannah River, say 40-some kilometers away from the ocean. What to do with it? Again, so they decided to deepen, but you cannot deepen because the river is narrow to some extent. So there was a whole public debate what should be the depth. Eventually, they reached an agreement at 47 feet. Why 47 feet, for God's sake, while the Panama Canal is going to 50 feet and other ports? So the issue is very difficult. Now, what I see other than the US, which probably the model is not working, is that the Port Authority basically gave away their traditional role of providing infrastructure and moving toward regulation. What I call it, the BARE, B-A-R-E terminal concept. Somebody is willing to put a big container terminals, he's welcome. Here is a piece of water. This is it. There is a competition. You go for a concession process. We, the public, because ports are becoming so risky. You saw it here. So much competition. In the US, on a stretch of maybe 1,500 kilometers, you have 10 major ports. The distance between the port of Savannah and the port of Charleston is only 70 miles. It's the same hinterland. So why the public has to foot the risk? It's not that we have shortage of infrastructure. We have enough. So the idea is to step back, not to take risk. Let the private interest take more and more risk. And that was a story in Virginia. okay? Because Virginia needs a lot of money and Virginia is in competition, so why again the public should be involved in it? Why not give it to a private? So generally, yes, the movement is toward privatization, with one big exception, by the way. The most efficient port in the world is not Rotterdam, it's Singapore. And Singapore, you have an operating port authority. Everybody, the guy there in the gate, you know, checking papers, and the fellow in the crane, all of them working for the same authority. And the development of new terminal. So maybe it's a cultural issue. Chinese, Confucius, I don't know. They like it order. In the rest of the world, it's competition free.
Thank you, Dr. Ashar, and to all of the speakers through the morning. Let's take a short break and aim to come back soon after 11 if we can, as the Minister will be joining us. He's on a tight schedule as well. So outside in the cafe or at the Patrick hotspot, a quick coffee or tea, and perhaps bring that back with us to the room to keep the ideas flowing. Thank you all for your patience.